very impressive to see. Really appreciate it. I hope it's worth your time. Thank you, Ben. Ben was kind of the instigator and also has helped me with the proposal and other stuff. Please come in. And so I thank you for all your time. I hope it's worth it. I have to admit this talk got a little more formal than I expected it to. That's just how it kind of went. But in any case, it is, as Ben said, part of a larger project. And so I'm eager to hear your reactions. So anyway, Gallup poll from 2019. 12% of Americans rate members of Congress as high or very high in integrity. This is up from 8% in 2018, so that's a 50% increase. And as a result, members of Congress, at least for right now, are no longer the professional group that has the lowest rating. Car salespeople have the lowest rating. So they are now the second lowest. As for the president, I think you all know that story as well. Latest figures I see show that 56% of Americans believe that Donald Trump is not honest. However, in that regard, I want to also pass along two related facts. The first one is, again, the latest accounting I have from the Washington Post, is that Donald Trump has made over 16,000 false and misleading claims. And two, a majority of Republicans, 53%, believe that he is extremely or very honest. Just a sign of the times. So this distrust towards politicians is low right now, especially compared to pre-Watergate era. But the idea that politicians are not trustworthy is not new. It's forever thus. Politicians are shamelessly inconsistent. They spin. They answer the questions they want to answer instead of the ones that was asked. They beat talking points into the ground, and often they lie. Now, there are lots of ways to lie, lots of different kinds. When I say that politicians lie, I mean they misrepresent themselves. They present an opinion or a judgment about reality as true when they either know or genuinely believe it to be false. Now, sometimes we can demonstrate that a politician has lied. We uncover evidence that directly contradicts a claim that a politician has made. So when Donald Trump said he had no evidence, or they had no knowledge of a payment to Stormy Daniels, and we uncovered evidence that that was false, then we can say that Trump's statement was indubitably a lie. But this kind of confidence is rare, and this makes the whole conversation much more difficult. Here I revert to that famous philosopher, George Costanza, who said, just remember, Jerry, it's not a lie if you believe it. And he's right. If you believe a falsehood to be true, you are not lying. You're not helping. You're not bringing any light to a world that is too dark altogether, but you are not lying. So, while I accept that this quote is funny, I don't think it's merely funny. In fact, I think it's a little depressing. Because believing our own lies is easier than we all like to think it is. We are all inescapably biased, subject to motivated reasoning. And the more an outcome is tied to our identity, and the more the truth is a threat to that identity, the more likely our brains will work to convince us of a falsehood, and the more likely that effort will succeed. Right now we find ourselves in a climate where identities line up in two overarching tribes. Liliana Mason calls them two tribes to rule them all, Democrats and Republicans. And that means that right now accepting our own lies is very easy indeed. Again, the president has made 16,000 false and misleading statements. Nevertheless, a majority of Republicans believe him to be extremely or very honest. Given the human condition and our rampant tribalism, there is no reason to expect it to be otherwise. So all of this is to say that it is always difficult to demonstrate a lie, and it is especially difficult to do so right now. None of us can look into the soul of another and say with certainty that another person is lying. We simply do not know what someone truly believes. This is the primary reason why responsible media outlets are very reluctant to say that the president lies. 16,000 false or misleading statements, but they do not say 16,000 lies because they cannot know that that's what they are. Now, it is also true that while calling out a lie is difficult, we can increase our confidence that someone's lying. Because we all have a video recorder in our pockets, it frequently happens, for example, that we hear a partisan make a statement, but we know that they've made a previous statement that contradicts it. It's, of course, possible that they're not lying, but rather they've changed their mind. This is rare, and admissions to that fact are even rarer. Far more likely, what has changed is their calculus regarding their own self-interest. Most frequently, we see this change in a partisan self-interest when the same question, the same judgment, involves someone from the other party. This is, by the way, why I argue that consistency is another democratic virtue. But increased confidence is still not certainty. More often than not, only the liar really knows for sure. Let me add one other wrinkle. Sometimes politicians lie or mislead for very good reasons. Of course, you would not be disappointed in a politician if she lied during wartime. But consider some delicate negotiation. To keep things moving forward, a politician might have to misrepresent that things are moving at all. Thus, the good of the nation can require that politicians misrepresent themselves. It is, of course, absolutely true that politicians use this kind of prudential reasoning far more often than the situation warrants, but that does not change the fact that sometimes the circumstances do exist. More, even when politics is working well, there is a duplicity at the heart of it. First, politicians are extremely self-interested, self-possessed actors, but they claim not to be so. They claim universally, in fact, to be motivated by the best interests of the nation. The vote in the Senate yesterday was replete with examples of this. Two, I want to quote from Reinhold Niebuhr, who I really do think is respectful. The respective parties are bound to contest elections as if the future of the nation depended upon their victory. But they must nevertheless have a reserved conviction that this is not true, that the nation will be safe in the keeping of either party. In both instances, politicians routinely act as if something is true even though they know that it is not. That sounds an awful lot like misrepresenting yourself. But Niebuhr says that it is not merely acceptable, it is essential. In fact, he says that whenever a politician speaks this way, without that reserved conviction, the future of the, quote, the future of the nation is not safe no matter which party rules. So for all these reasons, demanding that a politician never lie might not just be impossible, it's probably a bad idea. And therefore, many have argued that calling for an ethics of honesty in politics is a hopeless enterprise. Well, fools rush in. I acknowledge all this to be so, but I still insist that honesty is a demand that we must put on politicians, and for that matter, on all of us democratic citizens. First, I want to turn to Hannah Arendt and her article, Truth in Politics. Arendt begins by acknowledging that, quote, truth and politics are on rather bad terms with each other. But she does not stop there. None of us, Arendt says, perceive the world exactly the same. Your experiences, your history, your desires, your values, none of these are the same as mine. But it goes deeper than this. For all of us, the reality we experience is mediated by our own senses, our brains, and our bodies. And all of those things are distinctive as well. That means two things. First, for each of us, whatever we experience, it is uniquely ours. We are all, in a limited but inescapable sense, epistemological monads. And two, the way we experience the world is necessarily abstracted, necessarily different from the way the world really is. And because this is the case, Arendt says, we need each other. We need to talk to each other. It is only through communication between individuals whereby we present, discuss, and evaluate our different perspectives that we can come to best understand the world. For Arendt, it is through communication that truth reveals itself. But if that communication is going to work, it requires commitment to two propositions. First, there is an objective world out there that exists whatever we think about it. And two, when we argue, we strive to convey our beliefs truthfully. Without these commitments, argument becomes ever less genuine and therefore ever less productive. In fact, without them, there really is no point in arguing at all. Now, this might seem like a philosophical argument, but Arendt spurned the title of philosopher. She called herself a political theorist, and just so, this is an argument about democratic politics. Democracy is about living together and not killing each other despite our deep and abiding differences. To do that, we have to accept those differences and strive to work through them, and we do that through procedures and institutions that are likewise built on argument. But that argument, too, formal and informal, requires those same commitments. Without them, democratic argument becomes pointless, and democratic politics becomes just about power. Without these commitments, democracy itself becomes unsustainable. Therefore, for Arendt, while it is true that politicians routinely misrepresent themselves, it is also true that democracy requires from all of us some shared commitment to the truth. We should therefore accept that the bar for truth is set very low, but we cannot throw the bar away, not if we want to maintain our democracy. There's another reason I want to highlight here. The claim that honesty and a shared commitment to objective facts is a sine qua non for a democracy is not merely some philosophical abstraction. In fact, it finds support most relevantly in the fact that democracy's enemies are trying so hard right now to undermine it. For reasons of time, I'm just going to focus on Russia and their propaganda arm, RT. Russian television, but it's RT. Their motto is question more. And I argue that that description of their objective is both accurate and pernicious. This is from the New York Times. RT is unquestionably a case study in the complexity of modern propaganda. It is both a slick modern television network dressed up with great visuals and stylish presenters, and a content farm that helps feed the European far right. Viewers find it difficult to discern exactly what is journalism and what is propaganda, what may be fake news and what is real but presented with a strong slant. Making discernment difficult, blurring the line between journalism and propaganda, between real and fake news, this is precisely the point. Later in that article, that same article, Robert Kuschel, who ran NATO's information office in Moscow, said this about the purpose of RT and Russia's propaganda. The Kremlin doesn't care, quote, if you agree with Russian policy or think Putin is wonderful, so long as it does its job. You start having doubts, and of 10 outrageous points, you take on 1 or 2. A bit of mud will always stick. And here is Peter Pomerantsev. I'm close as I can get. Author of Nothing is True and Everything is Possible. Pomerantsev compared current Russian propaganda to when his father worked for the BBC World Service. While Russia at that time attacked the idea that the BBC was impartial, today they attack, quote, the very idea that there is such a thing as impartiality. In sum, RT's objective is not to present an alternative perspective on the truth. It is to undermine the very premise that there is such a thing as truth. Their message is that nobody is on the level. If you are committed to the ideal of truth, indeed, if you think anybody is committed to that ideal, then you are a sucker. In his book On Tyranny, Timothy Snyder describes the goal of that strategy. Quote, "If nothing is true, then no one can criticize power, because there is no basis upon which to do so. If nothing is true, then all is spectacle. The biggest wallet pays for the most blinding lights. You submit to tyranny when you renounce the difference between what you want to hear and what is actually the case." To my mind, that sounds a lot like Arendt, and it ups the ante on truth-telling rather significantly, does it not? Both bias and lying are designed to preserve the self in the face of perceived threat. But in so doing, both subvert the possibility of genuine argument, both therefore undermine the pursuit and even the ideal of the truth. But bias is unconscious, lying is conscious and deliberate. We live in a time where tribalism threatens our democratic foundations. It is therefore especially important that we understand this difference. For all of us, democratic citizens, partisans, and politicians, telling the truth, even merely committing to the ideal of the truth, means we strive to limit the risk to democracy, to the lives that we believe. That commitment is not easy. For every partisan, it requires a certain degree of courage and frequently self-sacrifice. We saw that yesterday too. But every time someone accepts the cost and chooses to tell the truth anyway, they are choosing to help sustain democracy. The battle for the soul of democracy has always been with us. But actions like those of RT, and let's face it, many others, and the reality of 16,000 false and misleading statements, all of this reflects the fact that right now, this battle is pitched. If nothing else, telling the truth conveys to the world which side you are on.